As countries around the world begin to ease their coronavirus restrictions, a lot of people are wondering whether or not we'll go back to the way life was and the world was before the coronavirus. So we want to bring in Peter Engelke. Peter, you are the Deputy Director and Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council. And we're not talking about, life in the U.S. or your day-to-day life, but we're talking about, the world and the U.S. on the world stage.
So the relationship between U.S. and China on the world stage was, I don't think it could be categorized as being particularly positive. The U.S. and China have been in an ongoing spat over trade and the rules surrounding trade for quite some time. And there's, I think was and still is a rising concern in Washington-based foreign policy circles about what China's intentions are on the global stage, and whether or not China is going to become a full partner in the sort of within the international system, or whether or not it will turn into a rival to the United States, and possibly even eventually into an adversary. And so that was where the U.S.-China relationship was, I would say, before the pandemic struck. So I think the question now is, how is the pandemic changing that relationship looking forward? How might it change
that? Let me ask you about the credibility of the United States around the world. How has the U.S. response to the coronavirus pandemic impacted the credibility of this country and its perception, perhaps, that has existed, for many, many years, perhaps going back to the initiation of the Marshall Plan, as a global leader? Do other countries, and I don't mean, Russia and China, I'm talking about our allies within NATO, for example, do they still see the United States as a global leader, one that is a reliable partner when it comes to attacking or taking on or confronting a crisis that is seen as a global threat?
Right. So you're absolutely correct in that after the Second World War, the U.S. and its partners at the time, mostly European, but also some East Asian partners, and eventually expanding to many other parts of the world, the U.S. led an effort to build out of the rubble of the Second World War a set of institutions, a set of alliances based around the premise that cooperating and coordinating is better than fighting one another. And that world has benefited, the world that the U.S. led and created after the Second World War was to the enormous benefit of not only the rest of the world, but also to the United States itself. And historically, the U.S. has played this role, and you're absolutely correct in that our allies and partners in Europe, in East Asia, in Australia, New Zealand, et cetera, have looked to the United States for leadership consistently during the post-war period. The question, and I think you're phrasing it the correct way, the question now is the U.S. still seen in that light? And I think that it is framed appropriately. It is a question, as in, are we still that reliable partner? I think the answer is right now, the world wants us to be that reliable partner. They want us to step up. They want us to lead. And the question is, will we do so? Thus far, the United States is not doing particularly well when it comes to handling the pandemic in terms of number of cases, number of fatalities, sadly. And, not only are we going to be able to be looked at in terms of how we're going to handle this problem going forward in terms of the public health fallout, the economic fallout, but also critically what are we going to be doing on the foreign affairs front? And in my mind, it is a question. Are we going to continue to go and bolster our historic leadership position, or are we going to be going in another direction wherein we do not take up the mantle of leadership? To me, that is the central question that we face.
So that was almost sort of a conversation, I think, a little bit that was happening even before the coronavirus, as, President Trump continued to sort of push his America First agenda. And there was always a concern that where there's a vacuum, another country will slip in, particularly China. China had this major setback with the coronavirus, but they've turned the corner, and we find ourselves increasingly dependent on them, particularly for medical supplies. Is there a possibility that China really benefits from this?
Sure. So there is my co-author and I for this Atlantic Council report that we just published, which creates three scenarios. One of those scenarios is essentially a China first scenario. where the outcome is as you describe, where China recovers faster and it manages to look better in the eyes of the world compared to the U.S. and its historic European allies, so that China, its economic recovery is quicker than ours, but also it goes on a foreign affairs offensive, if you will, in terms of trying to tie other countries closer into its orbit relative to what the U.S. and Europe are able to do, or I should say not able to do in this particular scenario, wherein we struggle economically, Europe struggles economically, and we don't step up to engage in our own, if you will, offensive around cooperating and coordinating with other parts of the world. So yes, to answer your question, it is entirely plausible that China may actually come out stronger relative to the United States than before the pandemic hit, and that is a real risk.
So I guess, Peter, what's the most likely scenario here? Is there hope? It's a strange question to ask, but I'm just trying to understand if that you see that through the rubble, just as you pointed out after World War II, in the rubble of that horrific war that took millions of lives, here we are once again faced with a global threat. And a lot of it is going to depend on measures that are taken, not just to ensure the safety and security of citizens in a particular state or country, but to ensure the safety of citizens all around the world, because people travel and people move between borders. So how do you see it all playing out? And I guess the question becomes, are you hopeful about that scenario?
Well, I think we need to be hopeful at this time. I mean, I don't want to minimize what we're facing. There's almost no one left alive on Earth who survived or was alive, I should say, at the time of the last truly global pandemic, which was the Spanish flu of 1918-19. And none of those people, frankly, will remember it because they would have been very, very young. It is important to stay hopeful amidst all of this. And it's important to stay hopeful because although there's real downside risk that this pandemic is going to create a lot of economic dislocation, certainly the public health effects are severely consequential, including mortality. And there is real geopolitical risk as well. By geopolitical risk, I mean a fracturing of global alliances, a fracturing of global partnerships, and up to and including the possibility of conflict amongst major powers. But by the same token, the reason why we wrote our report, again, we have three scenarios in there. Two of those are negative, and one of them is positive. And the positive one is a message that the Atlantic Council, my institution, consistently reinforces in everything we do because we believe in it, which is that cooperation is better than not cooperating. Cooperating is better than not cooperating. And the world needs U.S. leadership. It needs leadership of the U.S. in concert with not only its allies and partners, again, historically Europe, historically some East Asian countries, and some in the Pacific Basin and elsewhere in the world. But also we need to be working alongside those countries that we don't necessarily define as allies, so we might even define as rivals, including China, in order to get to a more cooperative future world, one in which not only are we addressing the sources of the pandemic, so for example, we're eliminating sources of future pandemic risk, but we're also beginning to address other kinds of real systematic risks in the international system, including, for example, climate change and other kinds of risks that we know are on the horizon and that we know are coming, but that will require true coordinated efforts to solve. So there is a hopeful scenario that we do paint, which we call the new Renaissance, wherein the United States and leadership, bolstered by an American public that wants global solutions, we do pick up that mantle. We do lead alongside our allies and partners. We do work with China to address a host of questions on the medical front, i.e. the public health front, the economic recovery front, I should say, and in a variety of other ways in order to not only lift all the boats of all of the major three sort of poles of the world, which are the East Asian and Chinese pole, the European pole, and the North American or U.S. pole, but the rest of the world too, including the global South. And so we do paint a very hopeful scenario, but in order for that to happen, that will require leadership from the United States. There is no substitute for the United States still in this world that we inhabit. We think that there is a way out of this, but it's going to require some vision. It's going to require some willingness to engage. I guess, again, going back to what we started this conversation with, the question is the United States prepared to do that?
It's an excellent question, and I guess it's to be continued. But we enjoyed having this conversation. Peter Engelke, thank you very much.
Thank you both. I appreciate you having me on.